Today's video is brought to you by Skillshare. Hey friends, Elizabeth here from Plant-Based Bride, back again with another video. Today I'm setting up my bullet journal for September, and I'm very excited to do yet another mushroom theme. Now I know mushrooms aren't new for me. I've done mushroom themes before, but something about September, every year when it comes around, I just feel a deep urge to paint mushrooms. So here we are again. And because I just recently did a mushroom theme in my husband's bullet journal where I shared a bunch of fun mushroom facts, I'm gonna hold off on the facts in this video, and I'll link that one if you wanna go check it out, see another version of a mushroom theme in an A5 size bullet journal instead of a B5 size, and hear all the fun mushroom facts that I shared back then. Today I thought it would be fun to go back to basics and just really focus on the technique of what I'm doing, tips and tricks for anyone who might want to recreate this theme, who's maybe newer to painting with gouache and wants any tips and tricks from this non-expert. So I'm starting by prepping my pages by cutting out my tabs. I love to use tabs for my weeklies. I just find it way easier and faster to flip between them. So I pre-planned my setup, made sure I knew how many pages I needed, and I cut out one page with a tab, one page without, one page with a tab, one page without, until I get to the end of my weeklies. This is so that I can do my Faux Dutch Door rolling weekly spreads, which we'll talk about when we get there. I also cut away the bottom of the spreads within the weeklies so that I can do a little bit of artwork along the bottom, which you'll understand a little better once we get there. So flipping back to the first page, and I'm prepping my palette. For this setup, I decided to use exclusively gouache, which is very similar to watercolor. It's a water-based paint, but it's quite a bit more opaque, which means that you typically need less water to work with it, which is great when you're not using watercolor paper. So even though I'm using an art journal of notebook that's 160 GSM, the paper is amazing and can deal with a lot. It's still not watercolor paper, and I find using gouache just makes things a little easier. I don't need to wet my brush quite as much, and it means that I can do quite a few more layers. I can blend things more. I have a little bit more freedom without worrying about the pages getting super wrinkly. My gouache of choice is from Winsor & Newton. I use their designer's gouache line. All the specific colors I'm using I will link in the description box down below, along with all of the other supplies I use in this video, so you can check it out if you want the specific colors that I'm using here. My number one tip for painting mushrooms is to start light and to build up the darker areas, the shadows, and the details layer by layer. The more realistic you want a mushroom to look, the more details you're going to want. The more imperfections, little ridges and bumps and shadowy bits and wobbly bits, everything that makes the mushroom less perfect makes it look more real. I would highly recommend using reference photos. I had a bunch of different photos of different types of mushrooms that I was using for inspiration while I was painting, so I could constantly refer back and see some of the weird little imperfections that I wanted to incorporate into my own painting. And those are the things that really make a big difference with making the mushrooms look more real. So again, starting with the lighter layers and adding darker details. So I'm going to start with the lower portions of the mushrooms. So I'm creating my own really soft beige color to start, and just doing really simple, filling in the space, filling in the shapes. And then I'm mixing a little bit of darker brown into this color just to get a slightly darker beige or a light brown, and starting to add details. My go-to for painting is stipe, which is essentially the stem, the lower portion of a mushroom, vertical lines that follow the direction of the stipe, shadows under the cap, and then also little irregular splotches and little nicks and things that make it look like it might be a little dirty, and also has, you know, had a wild animal walk by and kind of take a chunk out of it at some point. For the cover page, I wanted to paint some orange mushrooms. I do not know what variety these are. As I said, I just found a bunch of pictures of mushrooms. So if you know what type of mushroom these are, or the other two types I paint in this video, please let me know in the comments. But I decided to go with an orange mushroom with a pretty traditional mushroom cap shape. So I'm starting with a lighter wash of this orangey color and then going in with a darker rust color to get those details. So again, an outline really helps with adding dimension. And for these mushrooms, again, I'm going with a lot of vertical lines that are darker from the top of the cap or the edge along the bottom of the cap. In some areas, I wanted to make extra dark to make it look like little wrinkles in the cap, little areas where there is more dimension. It's not just a perfect curve all the way around. The cap's sort of wrinkly and wobbly and natural. When I'm filling in larger areas with just the base color, I like to use a wetter brush so I can fill in the area more quickly and get a more consistent color. But when I'm doing the details, I like to have a drier brush. When the brush is drier, you can get a line that is less precise, less perfect, and that's really perfect when you're painting things from nature. Doing the same technique on the other mushrooms, again, focusing those lines starting from either the top or the bottom so that they're darker along the top or bottom and the center area is a little bit lighter, and also using a slightly damp brush with not too much color on it to blend those lines a little bit more so they don't look too perfect, they don't look too defined. I want them to be subtle. Going back to the stipe again, and you can see here I'm adding way more detail. So again, I've mixed this light brown color just by adding a bit of a darker brown to the beige that I'd already mixed. And I'm adding lines starting from the bottom, really soft lines all the way up the stipe, a bunch of splotches along the bottom, along the sides, little irregularities, little tiny lines and dots. And then also, of course, shadows under the caps. I think one of my favorite things about painting mushrooms is that the messier you are, the better, typically, which is great because I can get worried about perfectionism when I'm painting, especially if I'm trying to make something look real. And I love when I'm painting something and me adding little weird bits and darker bits and lighter bits and splotching more color on the page. If that's what makes it look better, then I'm in heaven. It's wonderful. While those mushrooms dry as they are, I'm going to quickly add the calendar here on the right. And I'm going with a super simple calendar, pretty small spaces for each day. As I've explained before, I use my monthly calendar just for a really general overview. So I only really use this for events, appointments, if someone's visiting to indicate when they're arriving and when they're leaving, an eagle eye view of my month. And my weeklies get way more specific. So I don't typically need a lot of space on my monthly calendars. Going back to finish off my mushroom painting, and I'm just adding some environmental details. You can, of course, paint mushrooms that are just floating in the ether, but I thought it would be fun to add a couple little details to give them more of an environment. So just really messily adding some brown at the bottom to be dirt, adding some little brownish sprigs of other plants growing around them just to ground the painting a little bit. I also decided to add a really simple frame to this and to stamp September along the bottom. Of course, I wanted to make my tabs look beautiful and to go with the color scheme here, so I'm using the same beige color that I mixed for the stipes of these mushrooms to paint the first tab, and I'm going to work my way down using other colors from my color palette. The center page in between each set of tabs that doesn't have a tab is going to be folded in half. This is how I create my faux Dutch door for my rolling weekly. And now I'm going to move to paint the little mushrooms along the bottom. So these I'm painting on the first page of my weeklies and also the last page. And because I cut away the bottom of the rest of my weeklies, no matter which week I'm on, wherever I am in my weeklies during the month, I'll be able to see these cute little mushrooms along the bottom, just for a little extra decor without having to add decoration to each weekly individually, because I usually don't have time for that. And then I get sad that one weekly is really decorated and beautiful and the rest are super simple and I did them really fast. So these mushrooms, even though they're based on a different type and they have a different color palette, I'm still painting them in the same way. So I'm starting with a lighter yellow for the caps, and I'm also going with a really soft yellow for the stipes. And once that initial layer is dry, I'm going to go in and add darker details. So in this case, a darker yellow with a little bit more of an orange undertone. And again, focusing the darkness around the edges to give the caps and the stipes more dimension, and also doing again some more vertical lines, focusing those along the bottom of the stipes or the caps and also from the top of the caps, and a couple little irregularities. I didn't go quite as much into detail on these because they are so tiny, but I still wanted to add a couple little details. Once that second layer was dry, I went in again with an even darker orange to add those extra dark details and shadows. I also used the darker beige or the light brown that I used on the first mushrooms to add some details at the top of the stipe where some types of mushrooms have rings, just to add that shadow and a little bit more detail there. Once all of that was dry, I did the same thing that I did on the cover page, added some dirt along the bottom, and in this case, some green blades of grass, again, just to give these mushrooms a little bit of an environment without painting an entire scene. I definitely suggest using the smallest brushes you can for the details, and again, working from light to dark and also working from wet to dry. So the first layers that are really general, just filling in the base color, you can use a wetter brush and a larger brush if you wanted to, but as you go through the layers, you want to use a drier and a drier brush. You need a tiny bit of dampness to make sure that the paint moves where you want it to move, but you don't want to necessarily disturb the lower layers of your painting, and if your brush is too wet, you will disturb those lower layers. Sometimes that's great if you want to blend things together, if that's the technique you're going for, if there's a certain look you're going for, but if you just want to add details on top of what you've already painted and you don't want to change what's already there, you want to use a drier brush. And the smaller your brush is for those details, the better for really focusing the color where you want it. I'm also adding little frames around these mushrooms at the bottom and decided to add frames around each day of the week for my weekly. So I'll link my video where I go into detail explaining the rolling weekly, how I use it, why I use it, the faux Dutch door version, and also the simple 2-page version for anyone who's unfamiliar and wants to learn more. But the weekly itself is super simple, just using my stamps, a pen, and a ruler. But because I painted those mushrooms along the bottom, I feel like my weeklies really fit with the theme, and it's still fun to use and colorful, especially when you add those bright tabs along the sides. Moving to the final spread at the end of this setup, and I'm going to do a quote page on the left and a final painting on the right. So I'm painting yet another variety of mushrooms. Again, if you recognize any of these types, please let me know in the comments. Now for these ones, I broke my own rule and I started painting the caps really dark to start with. I do wish I had done a lighter layer first. I think just because it was one of the final things of this setup, I started rushing a little bit and I thought I would just start with the darker layer so I wouldn't have to do as many layers to build up dimension, and I did want the caps to be quite dark in the end, but I do wish I'd started just a little bit lighter, maybe mixed a little bit of white in, or possibly just used a little bit of a wetter brush so that I would have a little more leeway for having lighter areas in the caps as well. And the quote I decided to use this month is from Vincent van Gogh, one of my favorite artists, and the quote is, "I have nature and art and poetry, and if that is not enough, what is enough?" And I mean, what else do we need but nature and art and poetry? And maybe love and snuggles and books. Okay, there's a couple more things, but those things are really important. So as you can see, my first layer was quite dark for the caps of the mushrooms, so I have a little less leeway here. I can make them darker really easily, but making them lighter is a little harder. Again, I'm following the same techniques generally that I did on my other mushrooms, so starting with those really basic washes of color and then going back in to add those details. Again, on the stipes, I'm focusing on lines that follow the direction of the stipe, focusing the darker areas from the bottom and the top, adding shadows under the cap, and adding little splotches and tiny lines and imperfections to make them look more real. And this is really a process. I find it typically turns out better if I do it in many layers, slowly working my way from light to dark. And when I get impatient, like I did with the caps here and decided to start with a darker base, it's harder to get the look I'm going for. So I definitely recommend patience and starting light to dark and really working one layer at a time. It always works out better for me. For these mushrooms, I really wanted the caps to feel much more bulbous and like they were popping out more, really round. So I wanted my lines to be more rounded to hopefully give that effect. Again, reference images are your friend. I kept looking back at the reference image that I had of this type of mushroom just to get ideas for where those shadows were and where the lighter areas were, so I could try to emulate that. I mixed a greenish brown to use to create the base here, and again I'm adding some foliage around the mushrooms. Here, instead of really simple blades of grass, I decided to add little fern type branches just for something different. And for these, I'm just creating a long thin line and then using the shape of the brush to gently press down to get the shape of the leaves. So if you use a rounded brush with a bit of a point to your tip, you can really easily get leaves like this just by gently pressing and pulling the brush. I highly recommend getting brushes of different sizes, different shapes, and testing them out to see what kind of organic shapes you can get just by manipulating the brush without actually having to draw out the shape. I also decided here to add some water splotches. The reason I decided to do this is because I started so dark, I felt like there were no lighter spots and I really wished I had some. So adding some water spots was my attempt at pulling up some of that color and having lighter spots, and also for some more irregularity so that they would look a little more natural. So that's it for this setup. I hope you enjoyed my detailed explanation of different things I was doing. If there was anything I didn't explain that you have questions about, please leave them in the comments down below. Again, I'm no expert, but I have been painting mushrooms for a couple years now, and I do think every time I paint them, I get a little better. So I'm happy to share what I've learned. Before I show you the final flip through of all of the spreads, I want to talk to you about today's video sponsor, Skillshare. Y'all know I adore Skillshare, where individualism is celebrated and we can all go to get inspired and learn something new. You may be familiar with Skillshare's classes in photography, film and video editing, and illustration, but did you know Skillshare has hundreds of craft-focused classes too? From knitting to jewelry making to floral arranging and so much more, there are so many crafty classes to discover. Y'all know I'm a creative person and I love dipping my toe in all of the many glorious ways to practice creativity in my day-to-day life. Art, music, and dance are in my blood, but I've also always been an avid crafter, sewing, knitting, sculpting, and more from a very young age. As an adult, I love crafting for so many reasons, like sustainability by being able to repair and upcycle my clothes to give them a new life, and stress relief to zone out and work with my hands on something tangible. Not everything you create has to be a masterpiece either. Sometimes it's fun to create something small just for yourself, just for the sake of doing it, like a bookmark or a welcome mat for your door. I'm currently taking the class A Beginner's Guide to Mindful Macrame. I'm so excited to try macrame for the very first time, and I love that Ava explains all of the absolute basics. My cats are excited too, as you might imagine. So much string. I've loved working on this wall hanging so far. It's very meditative, which is awesome, and I really can't wait to finish it and be able to hang it up on the wall. So I'm challenging you to get crafty too. The first 1,000 people to use my link will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. I would love to know what kind of crafty classes you're going to check out. Thank you so much to Skillshare for sponsoring this video, and now let's do a little flip through of all the spreads here. I really enjoyed painting the mushrooms for this setup. I feel like every time I do a mushroom theme, I got a little bit better at painting them, and I just enjoy it so much every time. There's something about mushrooms. I just love how weird they are, how many different types there are, and how irregular and unique they are. And it's just a great message in general. What makes mushrooms so amazing is how different they all are, how incredibly unique. All of their little imperfections are what makes them special. And honestly, it's the same for people too, including me and including you. So with that very cheesy and yet true message, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Give it a like if you did and subscribe if you haven't already. And I will see you very soon in my next one. Bye, friends. Thank you as always to my patrons for your support. Y'all are the absolute best. I adore spending time with you in our patron Discord. If you want to join the squad, feel free. There's a link in the card and in the description box down below.